He slammed the plate down so hard the table shook. "You cooked in my house?" Marcus Hale's voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous, the kind of quiet that made the air feel thin. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, mud still on his boots, and stared at the girl sitting at his table like she owned every inch of it. "Who the hell are you?" She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, just looked at him with those steady gray eyes and said, "Sit down, the stew's getting cold." Marcus had survived 8 years of war, of frontier dust, of men who tried to bury him in unmarked ground. But nothing had prepared him for this. If you were standing in that doorway, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this hit you somewhere deep, somewhere real, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The cabin had been dead for 11 years. That was the only word for it. Dead. Not abandoned, not forgotten, but dead. The way something dies when the last person who loved it walks away and doesn't come back. The Boone homestead sat 3 miles up the eastern ridge above Creel's Valley, and most folks down in the settlement had long since stopped thinking about it. Children dared each other to walk past the rusted gate. Old-timers pointed at the dark windows and told the kind of half-true stories that grow in the space where facts run out. Silas Boone had been one of those facts. He came back on a Tuesday in late October, which felt appropriate somehow because October in this part of the country was the season when things died without any drama about it. Just a slow, colorless letting go. He was 31 years old and looked 45. His left knee ached in cold weather from a piece of iron he'd caught at the Battle of Ridgemore, and he carried a scar along his jaw that had never healed quite flat. His horse, a bad-tempered roan gelding named Hector, was the only creature on earth that seemed genuinely pleased to see him. He hadn't planned to come home. That was the honest truth of it. He'd been riding north with a loose idea of finding work near the lumber camps when his body just stopped. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories. He woke up one morning at a way station, looked north at the road ahead of him, and realized he had absolutely no desire to keep going. It was the first time in years he'd known with any certainty what he didn't want. He figured that was close enough to direction. So he turned east, and then south, and then up the ridge. He told himself he just wanted to see the place. That was all. Just look at it, remember what it used to be, and ride back down before dark. A man could do that. A man could stand at the edge of something painful and not fall in. He smelled the smoke before he saw the cabin. At first, he thought it was coming from somewhere else. A brush fire, maybe. Something natural and explainable. But as Hector climbed the last quarter mile of the path, the smell thickened and it changed. It wasn't brush smoke. It was wood smoke, the kind that comes from a cooking fire, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, the smell of meat and onions and something sweet, something baked. Silas pulled Hector to a stop. He sat there for a full minute, not moving, just looking at the chimney he could now see above the tree line, a thin thread of gray smoke rising into a white October sky. His right hand found the grip of his pistol without any conscious decision to put it there. He came around the last bend in the path and saw the cabin, and what he saw made something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the weather. The place was fixed, not renovated, not rebuilt, just quietly, carefully put back together. The fence along the south pasture had been repaired, the broken rails replaced with fresh-cut timber. The woodpile beside the door was stacked high and neat, the kind of stack that takes real time to build. The front step, which had rotted clear through, he remembered, the summer before he left, had been replaced with a solid plank. Someone had rehung the window shutters. Someone had cleared the bramble from the front path. Someone had been living here. He dismounted slowly, keeping his eyes on the door, and tied Hector to the fence post. His knee complained as he walked toward the cabin, and he ignored it the way he ignored most things that complained. He stopped 2 feet from the door and listened. From inside, he could hear the faint sound of movement. A chair. The scrape of something across a wood surface. He pushed the door open. The inside of the cabin was warm. A fire burned in the stone hearth, steady and well-tended. The table, his father's table, heavy oak, scratched with 40 years of family meals, was set for one, with a bowl of stew steaming in the center. The floor had been swept. The walls had been cleared of the cobwebs he'd expected. On a wooden shelf above the fireplace, someone had set 3 small candles, burned partway down, standing in a row. At the table, sitting with her hands folded and her back straight, was a young woman he had never seen before in his life. She was maybe 20, 22 at most. Brown hair pulled back in a plain knot. A dress that was clean but practical, the kind women wore when they expected to work. She had gray eyes, serious and calm, and she looked at him the way you look at someone you've been expecting. Not surprised, not afraid, just quietly ready. "You're Silas," she said. It wasn't a question. His hand was on the pistol. He didn't draw it, but he didn't move it either. "Who are you?" "Lydia Ashcroft." She said it like a complete sentence, like it explained something. It didn't explain a single thing. "How did you get in here?" he said. "The back window was broken." She tilted her head slightly toward the side of the cabin. "I fixed it after, so it latches now." He stared at her. "How long have you been here?" 7 months. 7 months. He turned that number over in his head and couldn't make it fit anything rational. 7 months. While he was riding useless roads and sleeping in way station straw, someone had been living in his dead father's cabin for 7 months. "Why?" he said. She looked at the bowl of stew and then back at him. "Sit down. I'll explain after you eat." "Lady, I am not—" "You haven't eaten today," she said. "I can see it. You've been riding since before dawn. Sit down, eat something warm, and then we'll talk about everything you want to talk about." She paused. "The bowl's yours." "I already ate." He stood there for another long moment, hand on his pistol, staring at this stranger who was sitting at his father's table and telling him to sit down in his own house like she had some authority over the situation. Part of him wanted to put her out the door immediately. The part of him that had learned in 8 hard years to read people for danger found nothing dangerous in her, which almost made it worse because he couldn't find a reason for it. He pulled the chair out and sat down. He ate standing up for the first 3 years after he joined the cavalry, and then sitting on the ground for the next 2, and the chair and the hot food and the warmth of the fire hit him harder than he was ready for. The stew was good, real good. Venison, he thought, with root vegetables and something that might have been sage. His mother had cooked with sage. He didn't say it was good, he just ate. Lydia sat across from him, hands in her lap, not talking, not fidgeting. Most people couldn't hold a silence. They filled it with noise because silence made them nervous. She just sat in it like it was comfortable ground. When he finished, he set down the spoon and looked at her directly. "Talk." She nodded once, like she'd been waiting patiently for a signal. "I found this place about 9 months ago," she said. "I was moving through from the eastern counties. I needed somewhere to stop that wasn't a settlement." She said the word settlement with a flatness that told him there was a story there she wasn't getting into. "The cabin was open, derelict. I came in thinking I'd stay one night. And stayed 7 months. I meant to leave after the winter." She glanced at the fire. "But by the time the ground thawed, I'd already put so much work into the place that walking away felt—" She paused, looking for the right word. "Wasteful." "This isn't your property. I know that. You have no legal right to be here." "I know that too." He leaned back and studied her. She held his gaze without defiance, but without backing down either. She was nervous. He could see it now, a slight tension in her jaw. The way she was being very deliberate about keeping her hand still, but she was managing it well, better than most. "What are you running from?" he said. Something shifted in her face. Not guilt, exactly. More like the recognition that he'd cut to it faster than she'd planned for. "That's a longer conversation," she said carefully. "We're not going anywhere." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father died 2 years ago. He owed money to people who don't forgive debts. I left before they could collect the debt from me instead." She said it plainly, without self-pity, like a series of facts she'd already made her peace with. "I've been moving around since then, doing work where I could find it, avoiding places where someone might recognize my family name." "Ashcroft," he said. "Ashcroft," she confirmed. She watched him, waiting to see if the name meant something to him. It didn't. He told her so. Some of the tension in her jaw eased. "That's a relief," she said, and for the first time the ghost of something like a smile crossed her face. It changed her whole expression, made her look younger and, briefly, like someone who hadn't been carrying weight for a very long time. He found himself thinking that she probably hadn't smiled much lately. He understood that. He pushed back from the table and stood, walking to the window and looking out at the last of the afternoon light spreading itself thin across the ridge. Hector was visible through the glass, unbothered, grazing the dry grass beside the fence. "You fixed the fence," he said without turning around. "The south section was down. The pasture would have been useless through the winter. The woodpile. I cut most of it in August. There's enough for the season." He turned back to look at her. "Why? You didn't know I was coming?" "No," she agreed, "but I knew someone would eventually. A property like this doesn't stay forgotten forever." She met his eyes, and it felt wrong to take the shelter without giving something back to it. He didn't say anything to that. He wasn't sure he had anything to say. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was picking up, the way it did at this altitude in October, finding every gap and testing it. The cabin held. He noticed that too. The draft he remembered along the north wall was gone. She'd sealed it. "You can't stay here," he said finally. She nodded slowly, like she'd expected this. "I know. This is my father's land. My land. I know that. I need—" He stopped. What did he need? He'd come here with no plan. He'd come here on instinct and exhaustion, and the vague hope of finding something recognizable in a world that had spent 8 years rearranging itself without asking him. He'd expected an empty cabin, dust, cold hearth, a place to sit with his failures without anyone watching. He had not expected this. "Give me tonight," he said. "I'll sleep in the barn. Tomorrow I'll decide what happens next." She didn't argue. She simply nodded and stood, beginning to clear the table with quiet, efficient movements. He picked up his saddlebags from where he'd dropped them and moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. "The stew was good," he said. He wasn't sure why he said it. She kept her back to him, rinsing the bowl at the basin. "There's more in the pot if you want it in the morning." He went to the barn. He lay in the dark on clean straw. She'd cleaned the barn too, he noticed, with a deep, disoriented feeling he couldn't quite name, and stared at the ceiling and listened to Hector breathing in the next stall and tried to think clearly about what he was going to do. He couldn't make himself think about sending her away without feeling something resist it. Not because he had any particular attachment to her. He didn't know her, and everything she'd told him could be a lie, but because he kept seeing the 3 candles on the shelf. 3 candles burned partway down, standing in a row. His mother had kept 3 candles on that shelf. She'd lit them every evening. There was no logical reason for a stranger passing through to set 3 candles in exactly that spot. He fell asleep before he could work out what it meant. Down in Creel's Valley, in the lamplit common room of the Harker's Creek trading post, a different conversation was happening. 2 men sat at a corner table with their heads together and their voices low, passing a folded map between them. The map showed land boundaries. Several of them had been penciled over in red. The Boone property was marked in red. "Heard someone's up at the old Boone place," said the first man. He was thick through the shoulders and had the careful eyes of someone who made his living noticing things. His name was Aldred Cole, and he ran a small outfit that had grown considerably in the past 3 years by acquiring land that other people weren't using anymore. "Heard the same," said the second man. He was younger and had the look of someone who'd learned to be agreeable as a survival strategy. "Some woman, they say, living up there alone." "Not alone anymore," Cole said. He folded the map and tucked it into his coat. "Boy named Boone came back today. Rode up the ridge this afternoon." He picked up his glass. "Inconvenient timing. You think he knows about the deed claim?" Cole turned his glass slowly in his hand. "He's been gone 11 years. He doesn't know anything about anything." He looked toward the window in the direction of the ridge. "That's the problem with men who leave. They think they can come back and pick up what they left behind." He took a slow drink. "They forget other people have been building while they were gone." The younger man shifted in his chair. "So what do we do?" Cole set down his glass. "We give him a week to realize the situation. Most men, when they see how complicated things have gotten, they make the sensible choice." He said it pleasantly, the way reasonable men discuss reasonable things. "If he doesn't—" He left the rest of it in the air between them. Upstairs in the trading post, through the thin floor, a woman named Doris Kettner heard every word. She was 58 years old and had lived in this valley her entire life, and knew exactly who Aldred Cole was, and what his careful, pleasant voice meant when it talked about men making sensible choices. She sat very still for a moment. Then she got up quietly and went to find her husband. On the ridge, in the dark barn, Silas Boone slept for the first time in months without dreaming about dead men. And in the cabin, Lydia Ashcroft sat beside the dying fire, with her knees drawn up and her chin on her hands, looking at the 3 candles she'd placed on the shelf without entirely knowing why, and thought about the look on his face when he'd first walked through that door. She'd expected anger. She'd prepared for it. What she hadn't prepared for was the way he'd looked at the room. Not at her, not at the evidence of her occupation, but at the room itself, with an expression like someone hearing a piece of music they thought they'd forgotten and finding every note still there. She'd been waiting 7 months to see that look. She just hadn't known it until tonight. He was up before first light, not because he'd slept well. He hadn't. Not really. Not the way a man sleeps when his mind has settled into something, but because old habits don't dissolve just because you've come home. 8 years of waking at false dawn, of listening to the silence before the world started moving, had rewired something fundamental in him. His body didn't know how to stay down once the darkness started thinning. He sat up in the straw and listened. The barn was quiet. Hector shifted in the next stall, a slow and comfortable sound. Outside, the wind had dropped overnight, and the ridge was holding that particular stillness that comes just before sunrise, when everything seems to be waiting for permission to begin. He could hear faintly the sound of the cabin's back door opening and closing. He was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move. He came around the side of the barn and saw Lydia at the edge of the yard, carrying a wooden bucket toward the well. She hadn't heard him yet. She was moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd been doing this particular task for months. Not thinking about it, just doing it, the bucket swinging easy at her side, her breath fogging in the cold air. He watched her for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he said, "I'll do that." She stopped and looked at him over her shoulder, not startled, the way people aren't startled when they've already been alert. "I've got it." "I know you've got it." He crossed the yard and took the bucket from her hand before she could argue further. She let him, but he could feel her watching him as he worked the well handle, measuring something in the gesture that he couldn't quite read. The water came up cold enough to ache in his hands. They went inside without discussing it, which was, he was beginning to understand, how things went with her. She started the fire. He filled the water pot. She pulled cornmeal from a sack on the shelf. He found 2 tin cups and rinsed them without being asked. Neither of them explained what they were doing or why. It just happened, the way things happen between people who have each spent a long time living alone and have learned to work around another person's presence without making a production of it. The cornbread she made was plain and it was hot, and he ate 2 pieces standing at the window watching the light come up over the eastern ridge. "I'm not leaving today," he said. "I know," she said. "That's not an invitation for you to stay." "I didn't take it as one." He turned from the window and looked at her. She was eating her own piece of cornbread, leaning against the far wall, and she met his look with that same direct, unhurried steadiness from the night before. He had the feeling, again, that she'd already had most of this conversation in her head before it happened. "What do you want from me?" he said, flat. Not cruel, but direct. She seemed to consider it genuinely, which he hadn't expected. Most people asked a question like that, either got defensive or gave you the answer they thought you wanted to hear. She just thought about it for a moment, her piece of cornbread held in both hands, and then said, "Nothing. I don't want anything from you." "Then explain to me what this is." "It's a roof," she said simply. "That's all. It's been a roof I could count on, and work I could do without anyone looking over my shoulder, and quiet that didn't feel threatening." She paused. "I understand that it's yours. I knew that going in. I always knew this was borrowed time." She looked down at her hands. "I just didn't think borrowed time would feel so much like the real thing." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He went outside and started checking the fence line. He spent most of that morning walking the property, relearning its edges, finding places where Lydia's repairs ended and the original decay began. She'd done serious work. He could see that without wanting to acknowledge it. The south pasture fence was solid. The root cellar door had been rehung and sealed against water. The kitchen garden on the east side of the cabin, which his mother had kept, had been cleared of years of overgrowth, and the soil turned, though it was too late in the season now for planting. She hadn't just been surviving here, she'd been tending it. Around mid-morning, he found a section of the north fence that needed attention. 3 rails gone, probably broken under heavy snow the previous winter. He went to the barn for tools and found the toolbox his father had kept on the left wall. exactly where it had always been, cleaned and organized and stocked with new nails. He stood there looking at it for longer than made sense. He pulled out a hammer and went to fix the fence. An hour into the work, he heard hoofbeats on the path below. He set down the hammer and straightened up, one hand moving to his hip, and watched two riders come up through the tree line. They were moving at a conversational pace, not aggressive, the kind of pace that says, we're neighbors coming to say hello while still meaning something else entirely. They were both men he didn't know. The first was compact and middle-aged with a neat beard and the clothes of a man who did office work but wanted people to think he didn't. The second was younger, bigger, and had the bored, watchful eyes of a man employed to stand near the first one. They pulled up at the gate. "Morning," said the neat-bearded man pleasantly. "You'd be Silas Boone." "I would," Silas said. "Aldred Cole." He didn't offer a hand over the fence, which Silas noted. "I run a land management outfit down in the valley. We've been keeping an eye on this property, as it happens." He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced. "Glad to see someone's finally come back to look after it. It's been a long time." 11 years, Silas said. 11 years. Cole repeated it with the tone of a man making a point without quite making it. A lot can happen in 11 years, taxes unpaid, claims filed, county records get complicated. He tilted his head, sympathy on his face like a coat he'd put on for the occasion. "I'd hate to see you come back home only to find yourself in a legal tangle that's hard to get out of." Silas picked up the hammer. "I appreciate the concern. Just being neighborly." Cole's pleasant expression didn't move. "If you'd like to sit down sometime and talk through the situation, I'd be happy to help you understand where things stand, legally speaking." "I understand where things stand," Silas said. "This is my father's land. I'm his son. I'm here." Cole held the smile for a beat longer than comfortable. "Of course," he said. "Well, welcome back to the valley, Mr. Boone." He touched the brim of his hat, and the two of them turned and rode back down the path without hurrying. Silas stood at the fence line and watched them go. He stood there for a full minute after they disappeared into the tree line, hammer in his hand, the cold air moving through his jacket, and thought about the way Cole had said legally speaking, the careful weight of those two words, the thing they were doing that wasn't quite a threat. He went back to fixing the fence. When he came in at midday, Lydia was at the table with a ledger book he didn't recognize. She looked up when the door opened, and something in his face must have told her something, because she closed the book and waited. "Aldred Cole came by this morning," he said. She went still. "You know him," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know who he is." Her voice had shifted, gone quieter and more careful. "He came up once, in the spring, just to look at the place," he said. "He didn't know I was here. I saw him ride the boundary line from the barn. He had a man with him who was writing things down." "Writing what down?" "I don't know. I couldn't get close enough." She folded her hands on the table. "He came by the valley once while I was getting supplies. I was talking to the store owner. I heard him mention this property." She paused. He was talking about it in the past tense, like it already belonged to someone else. Silas pulled a chair out and sat down heavily. His knee was complaining from the morning's work, and he was cold in the bones, the way you get cold when you're no longer 22 and the weather has been at you all morning. He pressed his palm flat against the table and looked at the ledger book. "What is that?" he said. She slid it toward him. "Everything I've kept track of while I've been here. What I spent on supplies, what repairs I made, when I made them, dates." She looked at the book and then at him. "I don't know why I kept it. I just thought—" She stopped. "You thought documentation might matter someday." "I thought it was only fair," she said. "If someone came back and found all of this, they'd want to know what happened to their property. I wanted there to be a record." She paused. "I wasn't planning on being part of it. I just didn't want the place to be—" She looked for the word. "Invisible," Silas said. She looked at him. "Yes." He opened the ledger. The entries were written in a small, precise hand, dates and items and amounts, and they went back 9 months, the whole history of the place since she'd arrived laid out in columns. He turned pages and didn't speak, and she didn't push him. He stopped on an entry from April. Replaced north wall door seal, used pine pitch and cord, 3 hours work. He remembered that draft. He'd grown up with that draft. He remembered lying in his bed as a boy, listening to the wind find it in the night. He closed the ledger. "Thank you," he said. He said it roughly, like a man who doesn't say it often enough to be smooth about it. She nodded once and took the ledger back and set it on the shelf. That afternoon, he rode down into Creel's Valley for the first time in 11 years. He needed to look at the county land records himself, needed to understand what coal had meant by complicated, and he was not a man who was good at sitting with uncertainty once he'd identified it as a problem. The valley had grown. That was the first thing. It was bigger than he remembered, or maybe just denser, more buildings crowded into the same space, a second street of storefronts now behind the main one, a proper church with a painted sign, a schoolhouse. He was pretty sure hadn't existed when he left. The people moved with the slightly too busy energy of a community that is growing faster than it's ready for, everyone having somewhere to be. He found the county records office in a new building that still smelled of fresh timber. The clerk was a young man with ink on his fingers who looked at Silas with the cautious politeness of someone who has learned not to react to strangers until he knows which kind they are. Silas gave him the property location and waited. The clerk went into the back room and was gone a long time. When he came back, he set a folder on the counter and then, instead of opening it, looked at Silas with an expression that had moved past cautious and into something more like careful. "I need to ask," the clerk said, "are you Silas Boone, the son of Edmund Boone who held the original deed to the Ridge property?" "I am." The clerk pressed his lips together briefly. "When did you last pay taxes on the property?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Silas hadn't paid taxes. Of course he hadn't. He'd been gone 11 years. He'd been 16 when he left. His father had been 3 months dead, and the property had been the furthest thing from his mind. He'd gone to fight in a war and survive and had not once, in 8 years of fighting and 3 years of drifting, thought about land taxes. "Open the folder," Silas said. The clerk opened it. The records were neat and complete and told a clear and terrible story. 7 years of unpaid taxes, accumulated penalties, a formal delinquency notice sent 4 years ago to an address that no longer existed, and there it was. At the back of the folder, dated 8 months ago, a provisional claim filed by a holding company called Creel Valley Land Partners, LLC, citing prolonged delinquency and property abandonment. Creel Valley Land Partners. Silas looked at the filing agent's name at the bottom of the claim, Aldred Cole. He stood at that counter for a moment with his hands flat on the folder and worked very hard at keeping his face neutral, because the thing moving through him right now was not something he wanted visible to a county clerk he didn't know. "What does provisional mean?" he said. "It means it's not finalized." The clerk said it carefully, like he was picking a path through something. A contested claim, if filed by a legitimate heir with clear documentation of their identity and relationship to the original deed holder, can stay the provisional claim during a review period. He paused. The review period is 60 days. But a contest has to be filed within 30 days of the claimant being notified of the provisional status. When was that notification supposed to be sent? The clerk looked at the folder. It was sent to the property address itself, which, given what you've said about the property's status, he stopped. "Nobody was there to receive it," Silas said. "Nobody was there to receive it," the clerk agreed quietly. Silas pulled the folder toward him and looked at the date on the provisional claim. 8 months ago. Notification sent 9 days after filing. He did the arithmetic, and it sat in his stomach like something bad. He was 43 days past the 30-day notification window. He drove home up the ridge with his jaw set, and the cold coming down from the north in a way that meant serious weather was coming, and his knees screaming at him over every rut in the path, and the arithmetic running over and over in his head, telling him the same answer every time. He came through the door, and Lydia looked at him once and said, "What happened?" He told her. All of it, plain and straight, the taxes and the claim and the deadline, and Cole's name at the bottom of the filing. He sat in the chair while he talked, and she stood by the fire and listened without interrupting, her arms folded across her chest, and her face doing something complicated that he couldn't fully read. When he finished, she said, "The ledger." He looked at her. "Everything I recorded," she said, "every supply run, every repair, every date, I dated all of it from when I arrived. And I have receipts for most of the materials. That's 9 months of documented, continuous occupation of this property." She said it quickly, her voice urgent but controlled. If the property was legally abandoned, that claim might hold. But if someone has been actively maintaining it, filing improvements, that's a different picture, isn't it? He stared at her. "You're not the deed holder." "No, but I'm a witness to the condition of the property, to its continuous use, to the maintenance performed. She unfolded her arms and took a step toward him. And I can testify that when I arrived, there was no notice of any provisional claim posted anywhere on this property. Not on the door, not on the gate, not in the mailbox that's still standing at the bottom of the path. Which means notification procedures weren't properly followed. I was quiet for a long moment. "You thought about this," he said. "I started thinking about it in the spring," she admitted, "when I saw Cole riding the fence line." "You didn't tell me." "You weren't here in the spring." She held his gaze. "I didn't know if you were ever coming back. I didn't." She stopped and started again. "I was protecting the property the only way I could, the only way I knew how." He looked at the ledger on the shelf. He thought about the fence she'd fixed and the root cellar door she'd rehung and the 3 candles she'd placed on the shelf for reasons he still didn't understand, and the draft along the north wall that he'd grown up with, and that was gone now because she'd sealed it one April afternoon and written it down in a book so there would be a record. The wind found the cabin then, a hard gust that tested every wall and moved on disappointed. The fire leaned and recovered. "I need to talk to someone who knows county law," he said. "Doris Kettner," Lydia said immediately. He raised an eyebrow. "She's the woman who runs the boarding house on the main street. She's been here longer than almost anyone in the valley. She knows the history of every piece of land within 20 miles. And she knows every person Cole has ever done business with." Lydia paused. "She looked me over the first time I came into the valley for supplies. Took about 30 seconds to decide I wasn't a threat. After that, she started leaving things for me." "What kind of things?" "Advice, mostly. Once, a jar of pickled beets she said she'd made too many of." A ghost of that brief smile again. "She's known something was wrong with Cole's operation for 2 years. She just doesn't have enough to say so publicly." "And you think she'd talk to me?" "I think she's been waiting for someone she can talk to," Lydia said. The next morning, he rode down to see Doris Kettner. She was not what he'd expected. He'd built up a picture in his head. Frontier matriarch, sharp eyes, formidable silences, and gotten about half of it right. She was in her late 50s, a solid, practical woman with gray-streaked hair and a face that had been pretty once and had settled now into something better than pretty, something that said, "I have outlasted things." She was sweeping her front porch when he arrived, and she looked up at him without surprise. "You'd be the Boone boy," she said. "I'd be the Boone man," he said, before he could decide if it was a good idea. She smiled at that, a real smile, not the kind people use to be polite. "Come inside, then." Her kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and old wood, and she poured him a cup and sat across from him and listened while he talked. She was a good listener, the kind that stays absolutely still, that doesn't offer little murmurs of sympathy that interrupt the speaker's rhythm. She just listened. When he finished, she said, "Aldred Cole has done this to 3 other properties in this valley in the past 4 years." Silas set down his cup. "How is he doing this legally?" Silas said. "He's got a man in the county records office who makes sure notifications go slowly and receipts go missing." She said it flatly, a fact she'd had a long time to accept. "The system works the way it's supposed to, Mr. Boone. It's the people inside it who don't." "Do you have evidence of that?" "I have 30 years of watching how this valley works, and a very good memory." She looked at him directly. "What I don't have is documentation of the corruption itself. What you might have—" She paused, thinking it through. "The notification that was supposedly sent to the property address. If we can establish that it was never actually posted on the property, and that the property was not abandoned as claimed, that goes to the heart of the provisional filing's validity." "And the ledger?" Her eyebrows went up slightly. "Lydia kept records? 9 months of them, dated, with receipts." Doris Kettner looked at him for a moment with an expression that surprised him, something that looked almost like relief. "That girl," she said quietly, mostly to herself. She picked up her coffee cup. "Cole thinks this is already settled. That's his weakness. He moves before the ink is dry because he's never had anyone push back hard enough to make him reconsider." She set the cup down. "You're going to have to push back hard enough." "I'm aware of that." "Not alone," she said. "That's the other thing." She looked at him steadily. "The Purcells are not the only ones in this valley who've been watching Cole and wishing someone would draw a line. But nobody wants to be the first one to stand in front of him without knowing there's someone standing next to them." She paused. "If you're willing to contest this properly, through the county process, documented, clean, I believe you'd find that there are people in this valley who have been waiting for exactly that. Silas looked at his hands around the cup. He thought about the last 8 years, about what it cost to ask people for things, about the precise and particular humiliation of needing. He was not good at this. He knew that about himself. He'd always been better at doing things alone than at accepting that sometimes alone wasn't enough. He thought about Lydia sitting across from him the night before with the ledger on the table between them, saying I was protecting it the only way I could. All right, he said. He rode back up the ridge in the early afternoon with the sky going the color of old iron in the north, and the first real cold of the season moving down from the high country. The kind of cold that meant it was serious, that the mild weather was done, and what came next would test the things that had been built to last. When he got back to the cabin, Lydia was splitting wood at the side of the house. She set down the axe when he tied Hector to the post, and she waited, reading whatever was in his face. We need to talk to the Purcells, he said. She nodded. I know where they are. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he hadn't let himself do yet, directly and without the armor of suspicion. She was standing with the axe at her side in the fading afternoon light, and she looked like someone who'd been tired for a long time and had decided not to show it. And something about that particular kind of endurance, the quiet daily kind with no audience and no reward, hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. You could have left, he said. When Cole started writing the fence line, you could have packed and gone and not been involved in any of this. Yes, she said. Why didn't you? She looked at the cabin, then at the split wood stacked against the wall, then back at him, and her expression had something in it that was harder to name than anything she'd said in words so far, something with depth to it, something old. Because I was tired of leaving, she said. The wind came down off the ridge and moved between them, cold and smelling of coming snow. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he picked up the axe from where she'd set it down and split the next piece, and she stacked what he'd done without being asked, and they worked together in the failing light until the pile was sufficient and the first flakes were starting to come down from that iron-colored sky. Inside, while she stirred the pot on the fire and he dried his hands by the hearth, he said, I'm contesting the claim. Doris Kettner is going to help us find a lawyer who isn't Cole's. We need the ledger and every receipt you have, and we need your testimony about the notification notice, or the absence of it. He looked up at her. I need you to be willing to do that, publicly, in the county office, maybe in front of a judge. He held her gaze. It's going to put your name on record, in a valley where people talk. With your situation being what it is. She stirred the pot for a moment in silence. My father owed money to men who didn't deserve it, she said finally. I've been running from a consequence that was never rightfully mine. She let the spoon rest against the pot's edge. At some point, a person has to stop running from things that aren't their fault and start standing in front of things that are. She paused. This feels like my kind of thing to stand in front of. Outside, the snow was coming down in earnest now, the kind that settles in and means it, covering the fence. Lydia had mended and the woodpile she'd built, and the path up from the valley where, that very afternoon, Aldred Cole had been told by his man at the county office that someone had pulled the Boone property file. Cole sat with that information for a while, turning it in his mind, working out its edges. Then he called in the bigger man with the watchful eyes and gave him a very specific set of quiet instructions. Up on the ridge, Silas Boone ate hot stew by a fire in his father's house and listened to the snow come down against the roof he'd grown up under, and he didn't know yet what was being set in motion below him. But something in him, some animal thing honed by 8 years of knowing when trouble was moving in his direction, had gone alert without his permission. He looked across the table at Lydia, who was eating with her eyes on her bowl, and said nothing. But he stopped sleeping with his pistol on the far side of the room that night. He put it on the floor right beside where he slept, within arm's reach, the way he'd kept it in every dangerous place he'd ever laid his head. Some instincts don't wait to be proven right. They just know. The snow stayed 3 days. Not a blizzard, not the kind of weather that becomes a story people tell for years. Just 3 days of steady, committed snowfall that filled the fence line and softened the ridge into something almost gentle. It kept them inside more than out, and inside was a complicated place to be with a person you were still deciding what to make of. Silas spent the first snow day going through every drawer and shelf in the cabin, looking for anything his father might have left that bore on the property. Old tax receipts, the original deed, any correspondence with the county. He found the deed in a tin box under a loose floorboard in the bedroom, which was exactly where his father had always kept important papers, and holding it, the actual physical document, yellowed and stiff, with Edmund Boone's signature at the bottom in the careful hand of a man who hadn't gone to school past age 12, but had practiced his name until it looked like it meant something, did something to him that he hadn't been prepared for. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while with the deed in his hands. Lydia knocked on the doorframe. She'd been respectful of that room in a way she hadn't needed to be, had cleaned it but not rearranged anything, had kept it the way it was as if she'd understood, without being told, that some spaces need to be left alone. "Found it," he said. She looked at the document in his hands. "That helps," she said quietly. "Yeah." He folded it and put it in his coat's inside pocket close to him. "Yeah, it does." She disappeared back into the main room. He sat there another minute, listening to the snow press against the window, and thought about his father. Not the complicated end of it, not the drinking and the long silences and the way grief had unmade the man after Silas's mother died. But earlier, the version of Edmund Boone who had walked this fence line and known every post by name, who had driven those stakes himself, who had signed that deed with a careful hand because it was the most important thing he'd ever put his name to. He put it in his pocket and went back to work. On the second snow day, with nowhere to ride and the path down iced over enough to make it foolish, they ended up at the table together for most of the afternoon, organizing the ledger and the receipts, sorting them by date, building the clearest possible narrative of the property's continuous occupation. It was practical work and it kept them talking, but the talking kept sliding, the way it does when two people are stuck in close quarters with nothing but time, into less practical territory. He found out she'd been a school teacher, briefly, in the eastern counties before her father's debts caught up with the family. She'd liked it. She said this plainly, without sentimentality, just as a fact. She'd liked teaching, particularly the older children who were starting to think rather than just absorb, and leaving it had cost her something she hadn't fully expected to grieve. "How old were you?" he said. "When I started teaching, 19. "And when you left?" She thought about it. 20, almost 21. It felt older. She straightened a stack of receipts. Everything feels older when it ends than it did when it started. He understood that more than he wanted to say. She found out because she asked directly, and he decided that indirect questions deserved direct answers from him when he could manage it. That he joined the cavalry at 16 after his father died because there was nothing left to stay for, and the army was at least a place that told you where to be each morning. That he'd been good at the work in the way that you can be good at something without wanting to be defined by it. That the scar on his jaw was from a knife, not a bullet, from a man he'd once considered a friend, and that the betrayal had cost him more than the scar had. She didn't say she was sorry about any of it. He appreciated that. He'd had enough people sorry at him to last several lifetimes. What she did say was, "You came back, though." "I came back," he agreed. "Not everyone does." "No," he said. "Not everyone does." They sat with that for a while, the fire doing its work between them, the snow still coming down outside, the stack of organized receipts between them on the table like something they'd built together. On the morning of the third day, the snow stopped and the sky came out hard and blue and cold, the kind of blue that makes everything sharp and close, and Silas saddled Hector and rode down to find the Purcells. Lydia had given him directions that proved accurate, 3 miles south of the valley's main street, down a rutted track that had seen better decades, to a small farm that was doing its best against considerable odds. The house was standing, but needed attention. The barn was in better shape, which told him something about the people inside. You could tell a lot about a farming family by whether they kept the animals better than themselves. It usually meant they were practical rather than self-pitying, which was a combination Silas respected. A man came to the door before he reached it. He was perhaps 50, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat whatever's available, with a face weathered into a permanent expression of careful evaluation. He looked at Silas the way you look at someone riding toward you down a bad road, ready for whichever version of this turns out to be. "Purcell?" Silas said. "Martin Purcell." He didn't move from the doorway. "Silas Boone. I own the ridge property above the valley." He stopped Hector at a respectful distance. "Doris Kettner suggested I come talk to you." Something shifted in Purcell's face. Not warmth exactly, but the opening of a door that had been locked. "Get down," he said. "Come inside." The kitchen held Martin Purcell, his wife Clara, who was small and angular with eyes that had been sharp once, and were now sharp in a different, harder direction, and their son Thomas, who was about 22 and had the contained anger of a young man who has watched his family treated badly and can't yet find the right place to put it. They told him their story. He listened the way Doris had listened to him, without interrupting. Cole had filed a provisional claim on their 40-acre parcel 18 months ago, citing a 5-year-old tax delinquency from a period when Martin Purcell had been recovering from a broken leg that had gone wrong and cost them 2 seasons of proper work. The notification had supposedly been posted on the property. Martin was certain it hadn't been. He'd been on that property every day, sick or not. By the time they understood what was happening, the contest window had closed. Cole had offered them a settlement that amounted to about a third of what the land was worth, and had made it clear, in the pleasant and reasonable way he made everything clear, that the alternative was a legal fight they probably couldn't afford. "We haven't signed," Clara Purcell said. She said it with the flatness of someone who has made a decision. So many times, it stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a bone. "Why not?" Silas said. He wasn't challenging it. He genuinely wanted to know what had kept them holding. She looked at him directly. "Because it's ours," she said. "My husband broke his back for that land. My son was born on it. I am not going to sign a paper that says it wasn't ours just because a man in a nice coat wants it." She paused. "Even if that's how it ends, even if we lose, I want someone to have to take it from us. I am not going to hand it over." Silas looked at Martin Purcell, who was looking at his wife with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite pain, and was both of those things at once. "We're contesting the Boone property claim," Silas said. "I have the original deed, a witness who can testify to continuous occupation, and documented evidence that notification procedures weren't properly followed." He looked at both of them. "If your situation is the same, and it sounds like it is, a joint challenge carries considerably more weight than either of us alone. It establishes a pattern rather than an isolated incident." Thomas Purcell leaned forward. "You think that'd actually work?" "I think it's better than the alternative," Silas said honestly. "I'm not going to promise you outcomes I can't guarantee, but I talked to Doris Kettner, and she thinks there are others in this valley who've been waiting for someone to move first. If we move together, clean and documented, we give them something to join." Martin Purcell was quiet for a long moment. Clara watched him. Thomas watched them both. "All right," Martin said finally. He said it the same way Silas had said it to Doris Kettner, roughly, like a man who knows the cost of what he's agreeing to and is agreeing anyway. Silas rode back up the ridge in the sharp afternoon light with the snow brilliant and blinding on either side of the path, and something settled in his chest that hadn't been there that morning. He told Lydia what had been said. She listened at the fire, her arms folded, nodding slowly at the parts that mattered. "How soon can we get to the county office?" she asked. "Road'll be clear enough by tomorrow." He hesitated. "I want to talk to you about something else first." She looked at him. He'd been thinking about this for 2 days since the second snow day, turning it around in his head. He was not a man who brought things up without deciding first that they needed to be brought up, so she understood that whatever was coming had been waited on. "You know things about this property that you haven't told me," he said. "I'm not saying that as an accusation. I'm saying it because I keep noticing it." He met her eyes. "There are things you do here that you'd only do if you knew the place. Not just lived in it for 7 months. Knew it. The candles on the shelf. The way you sealed the north wall draft. The kitchen garden." He paused. "My mother kept that garden in exactly that configuration. Rows in exactly that order." Lydia was very still. "I didn't tell you that," he said. "I haven't described my mother to you. I haven't told you anything about how things used to be here." She didn't answer right away. The fire worked quietly between them. "How did you know about this place?" he said. "The real answer, not the traveling through story." She uncrossed her arms and looked at her hands. And when she spoke, her voice was different, quieter and more careful. The voice of someone who has rehearsed something many times and is now doing it in front of an audience for the first time and finding that rehearsal didn't fully prepare her. Silas sat very still. "We stayed 2 days," Lydia continued, "and on the second evening, it was late, after supper, there were men on the road. Outlaws, my father called them. 3 of them, coming up the path. And my father's face went the color of old ash when he saw them, because he knew what they wanted, which was the money he was carrying, which was everything we had." She stopped and took a breath. There was a boy in the yard, maybe 14, 15, dark hair. He saw my father's face, and he read the situation before anyone said a word to him, and he went to the stable and came back with a rifle and just stood there, in the path between the men and our wagon, not saying anything, just standing there with the rifle. She looked at Silas. The men read that too. They were 3, and he was 1, and he was 15 years old, but there was something in how he stood that made the arithmetic not work the way it should have. She shook her head slightly. They left, just turned around and went back down the road. And the boy put the rifle back in the stable and went back to whatever he'd been doing before, like it was nothing. The fire crackled. The next morning we left early, Lydia said. My mother was better. My father wanted to thank the boy, but he was already gone somewhere on the property. We didn't see him. She paused. I asked your mother his name. She said Silas. She was quiet a moment. I was 11 years old and I didn't fully understand what I'd seen, but I knew that we'd been in trouble and that trouble had been turned aside, and I knew whose name went with that. She looked at him steadily. I've known your name for 20 years. The room was very quiet. Silas sat with everything she'd said and turned it over carefully, the way you turn over something fragile, not sure yet if it will hold its own weight. You came here looking for me, he said. I came here. She stopped, started again. I came here because I didn't know where else to go, and because this place had been safe once, and I needed somewhere that had been safe. She pressed her lips together. I didn't expect it to still feel like that. I didn't expect... She made a small motion with her hand that encompassed the cabin and the fire and the winter outside, all of it. I didn't expect any of this. The candles, he said. She looked at the shelf, at the 3 candles standing in their row. Your mother lit them every evening, she said softly. She did it while we were there. It was the most ordinary thing. I don't know why it stayed with me. She paused. When I was getting the place ready? I don't know. The place ready? I don't know. It felt wrong without them. He looked at the candles for a long moment. Then he stood up and went to the window because he needed somewhere to put his eyes that wasn't her face, and he stood there looking at the snow-covered yard and the ridge falling away below it, and he breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth twice, the way he'd learned in the field to make himself stop feeling things long enough to think clearly. He had been a 15-year-old boy with a rifle and a yard to stand in, and he had done what needed doing in that moment, and then he'd forgotten it. That was the truth of it. He'd genuinely forgotten it. Not suppressed it, not filed it away, just let it go the way you let go of the ordinary moments of days you didn't know mattered. And it had changed someone's life. He didn't know how to hold that. He didn't know if you were supposed to hold it or just acknowledge it and set it back down. I don't remember you, he said. He turned from the window. I need to say that plainly. I'm sorry. I don't remember your family being here. I know, she said. I didn't expect you to. There was no reproach in it, just fact. You should have told me sooner. He studied her for a long time. They can be separate, he said finally, but they can also both be true at the same time. She didn't answer that. She turned back to the fire and adjusted a log that didn't need adjusting, and he let her have the silence because she'd earned it. 2 days later, they rode down to the county office together, and Silas filed a formal contest to the provisional claim on the Boone Ridge property with the original deed, Lydia's testimony regarding the notification notice, the ledger, and 38 receipts organized by date attached as documentation. The clerk, a different one than Silas had seen before, an older man who processed the filing with a careful neutrality that suggested he was very aware of whose name was on the opposing claim, stamped it received and said the review process would begin within the week. Outside on the street, Silas and Lydia stood in the cold, and Doris Kettner came out of the hardware store across the way, read their faces, and said, Good, come have coffee. Over coffee at Doris's table, with Martin Purcell present, and 2 other Valley ranchers who Doris had gathered without explaining exactly why until now. A widow named Frances Gale, who farmed the Western Valley, and a quiet man named Joseph Eldon, who ran cattle on the North Ridge. Silas laid out what they were doing and what he believed could be done if people were willing to be counted. Frances Gale listened with her hands around her cup and her face still, and then said, Cole spoke to me last spring about my property, said I should think about simplifying my situation. She said simplifying the way you say a word you want everyone in the room to understand the meaning behind. I told him my situation was as simple as I needed it. She paused. I'd like to be counted. Joseph Eldon nodded once, which Doris seemed to understand as the equivalent of a speech. Martin Purcell said he'd already decided, and that Clara had told him to come back with good news or not bother coming back, which produced the closest thing to laughter the room had managed. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it broke up, Silas and Lydia walked out into the cold afternoon with something that hadn't existed that morning. The beginning of a thing. Not an alliance, not yet, not organized enough for that word, but a room full of people who had stopped being alone with the same problem. They were halfway up the ridge path when the other rider found them. He came down fast from the North Fork, cutting across the ridge at an angle that wasn't a natural route for anyone heading anywhere legitimate, and he pulled up 20 feet ahead of them in the middle of the path in a way that used his horse's size deliberately. It was the big man from Cole's visit, the watchful one with the bored eyes, who was not bored now. "Mr. Boone," he said. Pleasant. The same pleasantness his employer used, learned from the same source. "Mr. Cole was hoping you might have reconsidered the situation." "The situation is being handled through the county process," Silas said. "Right." The man nodded slowly, like someone had said something he expected. His eyes moved to Lydia and stayed there for a moment, measuring something, and Silas felt something in him go still and cold and very attentive. "Thing is, the county process can be slow, and slow can get expensive." He paused. "And people's situations can get complicated in the meanwhile." "People's situations," Silas said. "Yours, your companions." His eyes stayed on Lydia. "Woman traveling under a name she's not sure she wants on public record. County proceedings are public record, Mr. Boone. Anyone looking for anyone can find them there." The silence stretched. Lydia's face had gone still. Not frightened. Something past frightened. Something that had gone through frightened and come out the other side into a kind of cold, clear certainty. "Let me explain something to you," Silas said. He kept his voice even and quiet. "I'm a man who spent 8 years in situations considerably more threatening than this conversation. I know the difference between a man who will act and a man who has been sent to talk." He looked at the rider steadily. "You've been sent to talk. So go back and tell Mr. Cole that the filing stands, that the people in that valley are done being alone with their problems, and that if he sends someone to this road again with a message like the one you just delivered, the next conversation will be with the county sheriff, and it will include a description of what was said here today." He held the man's gaze. "We're done." The rider held for a long 3 seconds. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, unhurried, which was the only dignity he had left. Silas and Lydia sat their horses in the middle of the path until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then Lydia said quietly, "He knows about my family's debts. Sounds like Cole does his research. If my name goes on a public record—" "We'll talk to Doris," he said. "There may be ways to structure your testimony that protect your situation. She'll know better than either of us." He looked at her. Her jaw was set and her back was straight, and she was doing the things she did where she managed the feeling very carefully, so it didn't show. He'd come to recognize it now. "You don't have to do this," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said, "but I'm going to." They rode the rest of the way up in silence, and the silence was not the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that happens between people who have said enough for now. That evening, after supper, Silas was checking his pistol at the table. Not from paranoia, just from the habit of a man who understands that situations sometimes move faster than you're ready for. When Lydia looked up from the ledger she was reviewing and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "When you were 15, when those men came up the road." She paused. "Were you afraid?" He set the pistol down and thought about it genuinely, reaching back to a boy he'd mostly stopped thinking of as himself. "Yes," he said. "My hands were shaking. I was holding the rifle hard enough that they ached afterward." She looked at him. "But you stood there anyway." "I stood there anyway." She was quiet a moment. "Why?" He thought about it. The real answer, not the clean one. "Because my mother was watching from the window," he said finally, "and because I didn't want her to see me run." Lydia looked at the fire. Then she said, "I think that's the most honest reason I've ever heard for courage." He picked up the pistol again and went back to checking it. "It's not a very grand reason." "No," she said. "That's what makes it honest." Outside, the night settled over the ridge, cold and clear, the snow hardening under a sky full of stars. Down in the valley, in the lamplight of a back office, Aldred Cole looked at the county filing that had been copied and delivered to him that afternoon and worked his jaw slowly, the way a man does when he's recalculating. He picked up a pen, set it down, picked it up again. He had not gotten as far as he'd gotten by being the kind of man who responded to first moves with second moves. He believed in overwhelming responses, in making the cost of opposition high enough, early enough, that opposition reconsidered itself. He wrote 3 names on a piece of paper, folded it, and called his man back in. The names were not Silas Boone's and not Lydia Ashcroft's. They were Martin Purcell, Francis Gale, and Joseph Eldon. In the morning, before Silas and Lydia knew what had moved in the dark, those 3 people would each wake to a version of the same message, hand-delivered, unsigned, comprehensively specific about what they stood to lose. Cole understood something that men like Silas sometimes forgot. You didn't fight a chain by pulling at the strongest link. You found the ones that had been worn down the longest, and you pulled there. Up on the ridge, Silas put his pistol on the floor beside where he slept and stared at the ceiling for a long while before his eyes closed. He didn't know what Cole had written, but the animal thing in him was awake, and it did not sleep again until morning. Martin Purcell arrived at the ridge cabin before 7 in the morning. Silas heard the hoofbeats coming up the path and was at the door before Martin had dismounted, reading the man's posture from 50 feet away. The set of his shoulders, the way he tied his horse with short, tight movements, and knowing before a word was spoken that something had broken loose in the night. Martin came through the door with his hat in his hands and his face doing the complicated work of a man who is angry and frightened and ashamed of the frightened part. "They went to Thomas," he said. Silas stepped back to let him in. Lydia was already up, already dressed, and she looked at Martin and then at Silas, and went to put the coffee on without being asked, because coffee was what you did when someone arrived with that face at that hour. Martin sat in the chair across from Silas and put his hat on the table and looked at it. "Someone left a letter at our gate last night, no name on it, addressed to Thomas." He pressed his lips together. It said that Thomas had outstanding debts from a card game in the eastern county. Said those debts had been purchased by a party who was prepared to be patient, but that patience had limits. He looked up. "My boy was 19 when he had that trouble. It was 2 years ago. He paid what he could, and the rest, we thought it was done." "What does the letter ask for?" Silas said. "Nothing, directly." Martin said it with the precision of a man who has reread the letter enough times to know exactly what it did and didn't say. It just describes the situation, describes it very accurately, and says that complicated situations have a way of becoming more complicated when people draw attention to themselves in public proceedings. He paused. "It doesn't say Cole's name. It doesn't say anything specific about the land claim. It's the most threatening thing I've ever read that contains no actual threat." Lydia set 2 cups of coffee on the table and remained standing. "Francis Gale?" Silas said. Martin nodded. "Doris sent word before I left. Francis got a letter too. Something about her late husband's estate, a debt he'd apparently carried that she didn't know about. Same style. No names, no demands, just information, delivered in the dark." "Eldon?" "Don't know yet." Silas picked up his cup and didn't drink from it, just held it and looked at the fire. He'd seen this before. Not this exactly, but the shape of it. The way certain men fought wasn't with fists or weapons, but with information, with the specific, targeted use of what people were afraid of. It was patient, and it was effective, and it was very hard to fight back against because it left no clear surface to push on. There was no punch to block, just the slow, heavy pressure of dread. "He did his research," Silas said. "He's been doing his research for years," Martin said, "probably on everyone in this valley who might someday be inconvenient." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "That's not something you put together in a night. He's been building a file on people," Lydia said, from where she stood by the fire. "That means he prepared for resistance, which means he expected resistance, which means he knew what he was doing wasn't entirely clean." Both men looked at her. "If you're only worried about people who fight back," she said, "it's because you know there's something to fight back against." She looked at Silas. "A man completely confident in his legal position doesn't build files on his neighbors. He doesn't need to." Silas set down his cup. He stood up and went to the window the way he always did when his mind was working, looking out at the ridge without really seeing it, letting the thought find its own shape. "The letters are the evidence," he said. Martin frowned. "They don't say anything specific. They don't need to." Silas turned around. "Think about what those letters represent. Cole has detailed private information about people in this valley, their debts, their histories, their family problems, information he has no legitimate business reason to possess. And he deployed that information the day after we filed a legal contest against him. He looked at Martin. That's not a coincidence a judge ignores. That's a pattern. He paused. If Frances has her letter and you have yours, and if Eldon received one, those letters together with the timing of the contest filing tell a story that the letters themselves don't have to spell out. Martin was quiet for a moment, working through it. You'd need people willing to produce them, publicly. Yes? Another silence. Thomas won't want... I know, Silas said. I'm not telling you what Thomas needs to want. I'm telling you what I see. He sat back down and looked at Martin directly. But I'll also tell you that Cole sent those letters because he thinks private pressure is cheaper than a public fight. He's betting that people will fold before he has to show his hand. He paused. He may be right. I can't make that decision for your family. Martin looked at his hat on the table. He turned it once with his fingers, around its brim, a slow, unconscious rotation. Clara will say, use the letter, he said finally. She'll say it without thinking twice. He let out a slow breath. Thomas will go along with what his mother says. He always does, even when he's pretending he won't. He looked up. What about the woman? Lydia's situation. Cole's man mentioned that on the road. We're handling it, Silas said. Martin looked at Lydia. You understand what you're risking, putting your name in the public record. I understand it, she said. She said it quietly and without drama, the way people confirm things they've already made peace with. Martin nodded once. Then he picked up his hat and stood. I'll talk to Clara. I'll send word by noon. He put his hat on and looked at Silas. You know what happens if this doesn't work. Cole will make it very bad for everyone who stood up. I know, Silas said. You're sure enough about this to ask other people to take that risk. It wasn't quite a question. Silas heard the real thing inside it. Not doubt about the plan, but the older question, the one men ask each other before they commit. Are you the kind of man I can trust with this? No, Silas said. I'm not sure. I'm not going to tell you I'm sure because I'm not, and you'd know it if I said it. He held Martin's eyes. What I'm sure about is that doing nothing is also a choice, and that choice has a cost that I can see from here. He paused. I'm asking you to make a decision I don't have the right to make for you. That's all I can honestly say. Martin held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement, one man recognizing another's honesty, and went out. They heard his horse go back down the path. Lydia picked up his untouched cup and poured it back into the pot. He'll do it, she said. Probably, Silas said. Clara will make sure of it. Despite everything, something almost like a smile moved across his face. Sounds like you know Clara Purcell pretty well. I've had coffee with her 4 times, Lydia said. That's enough. He looked at her. When did that happen? While you were doing other things. She turned back to the fire. Women talk, Silas. Especially in valleys where things aren't right and nobody's supposed to say so. He filed that away and went to saddle Hector. He wrote it to Doris Kettner's first. She was expecting him. She had the coffee already made and a look on her face that said she'd been up since before the letters arrived, working something through. I know about the letters, she said before he sat down. I've already spoken to Frances. She poured without asking. Frances is angry, which is more useful than frightened. She sat across from him. Her husband's debt. It was real, small and old, and the kind of thing a widow puts behind her, but Cole found it. She shook her head. He's been thorough. The letters are evidence of the pattern, Silas said. Doris looked at him with an expression that sharpened. Say more. He said more. He laid it out the same way he'd laid it out for Martin. The timing, what the information implied about Cole's preparation, what a collection of those letters presented to the county court alongside the filing would demonstrate about the nature of Cole's operation. Doris listened with her hands flat on the table, which he'd noticed was what she did when she was thinking hard enough that she'd stopped worrying about how she looked. When he finished, she said, There's a circuit judge named Harlan Marsh who comes through this county every 8 weeks. He's due in 14 days. She looked at her coffee. Harlan Marsh is the kind of man who was a lawyer for 20 years before he became a judge, and the kind of lawyer who got into law because something unfair happened to his family when he was young. She looked up. He does not like Aldred Cole. That's not something I can prove, but it's something I know. She paused. If we can get this matter calendared for his visit rather than letting it sit for the regular rotation, can you do that? She looked at him with a mild expression that was doing something else underneath. I have been in this valley for 30 years, she said. I know every person who holds a position and the birthday of every one of their children. She picked up her cup. Yes, I can do that. He rode back to the cabin with 14 days in his head and a list of what needed to be done in them. On the way up the ridge, he passed the north fence line and stopped for a moment, looking at the section he'd repaired on his first full day back. His work next to Lydia's work, the same fence, different hands, the joins visible up close, but the line continuous and solid. He sat there looking at it longer than made sense. Then he went up. The next 4 days moved with the particular quality of time when there is too much to do to think about anything else, which Silas recognized as a mercy. He rode to 4 more ranches in the surrounding area, people Doris had identified as having had their own encounters with Cole's operation, and he told each of them the same thing he'd told Martin, the plain version, the honest version, without promises he couldn't keep. 3 of them agreed to have their situations documented. One said he needed to think about it. One, a large man named Garrett, who had the resigned expression of someone who has been beaten before and expects to be beaten again, said he was sorry but he couldn't afford to be part of something that might not succeed. Silas thanked him for his time, which was all there was to say. Lydia spent those same days writing. She had a good hand, clear and precise, the schoolteacher's hand. And she was drafting a formal account of everything she'd witnessed regarding the property's condition, the absence of any notification posting, the timeline of her occupation and improvements. She wrote it and rewrote it, and on the 3rd morning she handed him a clean copy and asked him to read it. He read it at the table while she watched the fire. It was meticulous, dated, specific. It named Cole's visit to the fence line in the spring with a companion who was taking notes. It described the ledger and cross-referenced specific entries. It was, in the dry, specific language of documentation, exactly what they needed. But it was also something else. He could feel it beneath the careful language. The account of someone who had come to a place looking for something she couldn't fully name and had found herself making it home before she knew she was doing it. Not explicitly. Not in any language a judge would weigh, but there, in the choices about what to include, what to date, what to make sure was part of the record. She'd been protecting this place the whole time, from the moment she arrived until right now, sitting by the fire. This is good, he said. She looked over her shoulder. It's complete, she said, with the precision of someone who knows the difference. It's both, he said. She turned back to the fire. He folded the document and set it with the others. On the 6th day, Cole made his next move. It was not another letter. He was past letters. This time he sent a man, not the watchful one, a different one, older and more official-looking, carrying paperwork, to the 3 ranches whose owners had agreed to participate in the joint challenge. The man identified himself as a representative of a county assessor's firm and said there had been questions raised about the accuracy of property assessments in the area and that a formal review had been ordered. It was not a legal action. It was a performance of a legal action designed to look like one. The paperwork was real enough to be alarming at a glance and vague enough to mean nothing under scrutiny. Frances Gale called his bluff at her front door, which was characteristic of Frances Gale. She asked him to produce his official county credentials. And when he produced a business card instead of a county seal, she told him to get off her property. Thomas Purcell, who happened to be at the Gale Ranch when the man came by, memorized his face and the description of his horse and reported both to Doris Kettner before the afternoon was out. Doris sent a note to Silas. Silas read the note and sat with it for a while and then said to Lydia, "He's getting rattled." She looked up from the ledger. Rattled men make mistakes. Or they stop being careful about what they're willing to do, he said. She held his gaze. Which kind is Cole? He thought about the files Cole had built on his neighbors. The patience of that, the long, slow preparation of it. He's careful, he said. But he's been careful in a place where nobody pushed back. He doesn't have a lot of experience with resistance. Then we keep pushing, she said. On the 8th day, Silas went to see Garrett, the man who'd said he couldn't afford to be part of something that might fail. He went alone, in the morning, without telling Lydia where he was going, which he recognized was partly because he wasn't sure it would accomplish anything, and he didn't want to explain a failed attempt. Garrett answered the door with the same resigned expression and looked at Silas with the wariness of a man who knows what you've come to say before you say it. "I'm not here to change your mind," Silas said. Garrett's wariness shifted slightly. Then what? I wanted to ask you something. He stood in the doorway, not pushing past it. Cole's already been to your property once. The assessment man he sent around went to everyone else. You notice he didn't come here? Garrett was still. He didn't come here, Silas said, because you already said no. Because he figures you're not a problem. He paused. He's wrong about that. You're still in this valley. You still have land he wants eventually. He'll just wait until everyone else is handled and then come to you when you're alone. He looked at the man directly. I'm not telling you that to frighten you. I'm telling you because I think you already know it and you've been living with it. Garrett looked at his boots for a moment. Then he looked up. His face had the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that putting it down and picking something harder might actually feel like relief. What do you need from me? He said. The same thing I asked for before. Your account of what Cole's man said when he came to your property last year. Silas paused. Just the truth. That's all. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the space between them. All right, he said. He said it like tearing something off. That made 5 ranches. Doris had the 6th, her own 3 decades of observation, which she'd been writing down every evening since the day Silas had first come to her kitchen. She didn't tell him she was doing this. He found out because she handed him 14 pages of handwritten notes 2 days before the court date and said, I don't know how much of this a judge can use, but he can read it. He looked at the 14 pages and then at her. You've been keeping records too, he said. I've been keeping records for 6 years, she said, since the Harker property. She folded her hands in her lap. I didn't know what I was going to do with them. I just knew that the right person showing up with the right documentation at the right time was the only way any of this ever changes. She looked at him with an expression that was very old and very certain. I was waiting for the right person. He didn't know what to say to that either. It seemed to be a feature of this valley, people waiting for things they couldn't quite articulate, holding places open in their lives for something they hoped would eventually come. He thought about Lydia and the 3 candles on the shelf. The night before the court appearance, nobody slept well. Silas knew this because he was awake himself most of the night. Not anxious exactly, but in that state of extreme alertness that precedes things you can't control. And he could hear, faintly, Lydia moving in the main room. The careful sound of someone trying not to make sound, which is its own kind of noise. At some point after 2, he got up and went to the main room and found her sitting at the table with a candle and a cup of water, not doing anything, just sitting there with her hands around the cup and her eyes on the middle distance. She looked up when he came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He got himself a cup of water and sat down across from her. Tell me what you're worried about, he said. She looked at the candle. That it won't be enough, she said. That we've done everything correctly and it still won't be enough because Cole has money and time and the infrastructure of someone who's been doing this for years, and She stopped. 5 ranchers and a boarding house owner and a ledger full of receipts. And an original deed, he said. And an original deed. She paused. That's not nothing. I know it's not nothing. She pressed her lips together. I've been in situations where doing everything right still didn't. She stopped again. He knew what she meant. He'd been in those situations too. The battlefield kind, where every decision was sound and the outcome was still terrible, where the gap between what you deserved and what you got was wide enough to fall into. It might not be enough, he said. She looked at him. I'm not going to tell you it will be. I don't know. He held his cup in both hands. What I know is that we've built the strongest case we can build with what we have. We've done that without cutting corners and without doing anything that wasn't straight. Whatever happens tomorrow. He paused. We'll still be that. We'll still have done it right. That's cold comfort if we lose the land, she said. Yes, he said. It is. He looked at the candle. But it's the honest version of comfort, and that's the only kind I know how to offer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your mother used to say something like that. Not those words, but the same idea. She looked at him. I told you I was 11 when I was here. What I didn't say is that I had a very bad night the second night. Bad dream, woke up crying, the way you do when you're 11 and away from everything familiar. And your mother sat with me. She paused. She didn't tell me everything would be fine. She just sat there and said that the feeling passes and that the morning is different from the night. Not better necessarily. Different, and that different is enough. She looked at the candle. I've thought about that a lot over the years. Silas looked at the 3 candles on the shelf, the ones she'd placed there without fully knowing why. He thought about his mother at a table in this room, sitting with a frightened child she didn't know, not promising things she couldn't promise, just staying. She was better at this than I am, he said. She had practice, Lydia said. You'll get there. He looked at her. The thing in her face was complicated and honest and not quite what it had been when he'd first walked through that door 2 weeks ago, and he thought that probably the same was true of his own face, though he couldn't see it. Try to sleep, he said. You too, she said. He went back to the barn and lay down, and this time, eventually, he did. In the morning, they rode down together, Silas and Lydia, and behind them on the path, Martin and Clara Purcell, and Thomas with his jaw set like his mother's, and Francis Gale, who had come through Doris with fresh fury that had not dimmed overnight, and Joseph Eldon, and Garrett, who had come of his own decision and whose presence felt to Silas like something more than another number. They arrived at the county courthouse, a solid, plain building on the main street that served most official purposes in the valley, and found Doris Kettner already there, and the older clerk who'd stamped their filing, and a small group of other valley residents who had no legal stake in the proceedings but had come anyway. The way people come to the things that matter in small communities, because being present is itself a form of statement. Aldred Cole was already in the room. I was seated at a table with 2 men Silas didn't know, both of them in better coats than anyone else present, and he looked up when Silas came through the door with the same pleasant expression he'd worn at the fence, the same practiced composure. He looked at the people coming in behind Silas, and his expression didn't change, which was itself a tell. Too controlled, the composure of someone working to maintain it rather than someone who has no reason to do otherwise. Judge Harlan Marsh was not what Silas had pictured from Doris's description. He was short, somewhat rumpled, with the kind of face that would be easy to underestimate until it spoke. He came in from the back and settled himself behind the county clerk's table with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has presided over enough proceedings to have lost all patience with the theatrical parts of them. He looked at both tables, looked at the room, looked back at his papers. This is a contested provisional land claim, he said, without preamble. I have reviewed the filed documentation from both the claimant and the contestant. We'll hear from each party and from any witnesses. He looked at Cole's table. Claimant's counsel will note that I have some questions about the notification procedures employed in this case, which I'll be raising directly. Cole's expression still didn't move, but one of the men in the better coat shifted slightly. Silas set his documents on the table in front of him, and Lydia sat beside him with her written account in her hands, and the morning began. The hearing was not dramatic. That was the thing about real legal proceedings that stories never quite captured. They were slow and technical and full of language designed to be precise rather than exciting, and the drama lived in small moments that you had to be paying close attention to catch. Cole's counsel presented the claim competently. Unpaid taxes, formal delinquency, documented abandonment, notification, sent to the property address per procedure. It was clean and organized, and Silas sat through it without reacting, because reacting to the other side's presentation was for people who didn't trust their own. Then it was their turn. He presented the original deed first, and watched Judge Marsh examine it with the attention of someone who has seen enough fraudulent documents to know what a genuine one feels like. Then the timeline, 11 years of absence, the circumstances of departure, the return. Then Lydia's account, which she delivered in person at Marsh's request, standing at the front of the room with her hands at her sides and her voice steady, laying out the dates and the work and the condition of the property and the absence of any notification posting with the clear, organized precision of someone who has taught children to follow an argument and knows exactly how. And then, because Marsh had asked for it directly, the letters. Martin Purcell produced his. Francis Gale produced hers. Garrett, who had said almost nothing all morning, reached into his coat and produced a document that turned out to be not a letter, but a written account of the conversation Cole's man had had with him at his door the previous year. Specific, detailed, dated, signed with a witness. Cole's counsel objected. Marsh considered the objection and overruled it and said he'd like to see the letters. He read them slowly. The room was very quiet while he read. When he finished, he set them down and looked at Cole's table over his glasses. "Counsel," he said, Can you explain to me how your client came to possess detailed private financial information about individuals in this valley who are not parties to any business relationship with his company? The man in the better coat said that they were simply information available in the public record. Marsh said that detailed information about a private card game debt belonging to a young man, not party to any of these proceedings, was not, to his knowledge, part of the public record, and asked counsel to explain further. The explanation that followed was not convincing. Silas watched Cole's face during it and saw, for the first time, a small disruption in the pleasant expression. Not fear, not quite, but the particular shift of a man whose mathematics are coming up different than they did yesterday. When the proceedings broke for a midday recess, Doris appeared at Silas's elbow and said very quietly, "He's going to need the afternoon to review the documentation, but he's already decided." "You don't know that," Silas said. She looked at him. "I've watched Harlan Marsh in 3 proceedings in this valley," she said. "I know exactly what his face looks like when he's made up his mind." She paused. "He made it up about 40 minutes ago." She was right. Marsh's afternoon ruling was measured and precise and demolished the provisional claim on 6 separate grounds, the most significant being improper notification procedure. No evidence of posting at the property location could be produced, and a finding that the property had demonstrably not been abandoned, given 9 months of documented continuous occupation and maintenance. He noted that the correspondence produced by multiple Valley residents, combined with its timing relative to the legal contest filing, raised serious questions about the conduct of the claimant's operation that he was referring to the county attorney for further review. Cole stood when the ruling was read, and for one moment his pleasant expression was simply gone, and what was underneath it was something smaller and colder and more honest. Then it came back, and he said something to his counsel in a low voice, and they gathered their papers, and they left. He didn't look at Silas. Silas sat at the table for a moment after the room began to move and breathe around him. People talking. Francis Gale saying something emphatic to Martin Purcell, Doris with her hand briefly on Garrett's arm, in a gesture that said more than she'd probably intended. Lydia was sitting beside him, with her written account still in her hands, looking at the front of the room where Marsh had been. "It worked," she said. She said it like she was testing whether it was real. "It worked," he confirmed. She set the papers down on the table. Her hands weren't entirely steady. She looked at them for a moment and then pressed them flat on the papers, which steadied them. Thomas Purcell appeared beside the table and stuck his hand out at Silas, with the directness of a young man who's made a decision about something. Silas shook it. Thomas looked like he wanted to say something and settled for nodding instead, which was enough. Martin came next, and Clara said, "Good," once, firmly, the way she said everything, as if the word itself was a door being closed on a problem. It took a long time to leave because there were too many people and too much to say, and not enough language for most of it, which was fine. Most important things are short on language. When they finally came out into the afternoon and stood on the street with the cold coming down from the north and the valley opening up around them in its broad, ordinary, complicated way, Silas stood beside Lydia, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "The referral to the county attorney," she said. "What does that mean for Cole?" "Means someone will be looking at how he's done business," Silas said. "Whether anything comes of it," he paused. "I can't tell you, but it means he's not moving quietly anymore. He's visible now." He looked at the street, the town, the ordinary life of the valley going past them. "That matters." She nodded. "It also means," he said, that your name is on a county record, your testimony." She was quiet for a moment. "I know. The people your father owed." "I know," she said again. She turned to look at him. "I decided that when I agreed to testify. I decided that a month ago, on a road on the ridge when Cole's man said what he said." She paused. "I've been running from my father's mistakes for 2 years, and I'm tired of running from things that aren't mine." She looked at him steadily. If someone comes, I'll deal with it then, on my feet, in the open." She paused. "Not hiding in someone else's barn." He looked at her for a moment. The afternoon light came down cold and even over the valley street, and she stood in it without flinching. "The barn was fixed up," he said. She looked at him. "You cleaned the barn too," he said. "First week you were there, from what I can tell from the ledger. You cleaned the barn before you did almost anything else." She thought about it. "The animals needed somewhere decent," she said, "even if I didn't know whose they'd be." He was quiet for a moment. "Hector likes it," he said. And Lydia Ashcroft, who had been careful and contained and precise for 2 solid weeks of difficulty, laughed. A real one, short and surprised, the kind that gets out before you can decide whether to let it. And for a moment in the cold afternoon light, she looked exactly like what she was. A young woman who had survived a great deal and had more surviving ahead of her, and who was, right now, in this specific moment, not doing either. It was the best thing he'd heard in a long time. They rode back up the ridge in the late afternoon, the two of them, and the cabin was there at the top of the path the way it had been every time, holding its ground against the weather and the years. The smoke from the chimney they'd left burning rising straight in the still air. He didn't say anything about what came next. She didn't ask. They both understood that next was a different day's problem, and that today had been enough. He unsaddled Hector. She started supper. The valley below them went dark in the early way of November, the light going fast and the cold coming after it. And in Cole's office on the main street, a lamp burned late, while a man sat with a referral notice from the county court and understood, for the first time in 4 years of careful and patient work, that the ground under him had shifted. Up on the ridge, the fire burned in the hearth, and the 3 candles stood on the shelf, and the cabin held its warmth against the night, the way it had been built to do. And Silas Boone sat at his father's table in his father's house and ate a meal that someone had made for him, and did not feel, for once, like a man who had run out of road. The county attorney's name was Gerald Foss, and he was a man who had learned, over 17 years in a small valley jurisdiction, to move carefully around powerful people. He'd read Marcia's referral 3 times the morning it arrived, and then he'd set it in the center of his desk and looked at it for a while, the way you look at something you've been handed, that is both an opportunity and a considerable amount of trouble. Aldred Cole had been in this valley for 6 years. In that time, he had never been on the wrong side of a legal proceeding. He paid his taxes. He maintained good relationships with the right people. He donated to the church renovation fund and showed up at the right social events with the right expressions on his face. He was, by every visible measure, a respectable businessman. Gerald Foss knew better. He'd known better for 3 years and had done nothing, because knowing and proving are different countries, and the road between them is long and the toll is high. The referral changed the calculation. It wasn't that it gave him evidence he didn't have, it was that it gave him cover. A circuit judge's formal referral was not something he could quietly ignore the way he'd quietly ignored his own instincts. It was on the record, which meant his response to it was on the record. He picked up the referral and put it in his working file, and the next morning he sent a notice to Aldred Cole's office requesting a formal interview regarding the conduct of Creel Valley Land Partners over the preceding 4 years. Cole's response arrived the same afternoon, through his counsel, politely declining and asserting that all operations had been conducted within the law, and offering to provide documentation at a mutually convenient time. Foss read the response, set it in the file behind the referral, and began drafting subpoenas. He didn't tell Silas any of this directly. He told Doris Kettner because Doris Kettner had been in this valley 30 years and understood the difference between information that needed to travel and information that needed to stay put, and she parceled it out the way she parceled out everything, with precision and no wasted motion. She told Silas on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the hearing, when he came down for supplies and stopped in her kitchen, the way he'd been stopping in her kitchen regularly enough that it had become, without formal discussion, a habit. "Foss is moving," she said. She set coffee in front of him, slowly but moving. "How long?" he said. "Months, probably. Maybe longer. This isn't fast work." She sat down across from him. "But it started. Once it starts, Cole can't put it back." She paused. "He knows that, which is why he's been quiet." Cole's quiet was a thing Silas had been monitoring the way you monitor weather. Not the absence of trouble, but the redistribution of it. The calm that means the storm is organizing rather than dissipating. In the 2 weeks since the hearing, nothing overt had happened. No riders on the ridge path, no letters, no pleasant visits with unpleasant undertones. Just the ordinary continuation of valley life, with Cole moving through it the way he always had, present and agreeable, unchanged on the surface. "He's waiting," Silas said. "For what?" "To see if this holds together or falls apart on its own." He turned his cup in his hands. He's been doing this long enough to know that the hardest part of any organized resistance is sustaining it after the immediate crisis is over. People go back to their lives. The urgency fades. He paused. "He's patient." Doris looked at him. So are you. He didn't answer that. He finished his coffee and went to get his supplies. On the way back up the ridge, he passed the Purcell track, and on an impulse he couldn't have fully explained, he turned down it. Martin was in the barn when he arrived, patching a section of roof from the inside, balanced on a ladder with the particular focused expression of a man doing a job that requires all his attention and resents the interruption. He came down the ladder when he saw Silas, and they stood in the barn's cold interior and talked the way they'd been talking lately. Not about the proceedings specifically, but around them. The way men talk around important things when they're not sure yet what the important things are going to mean. Thomas has been different, Martin said. Not a complaint, just an observation. Different how? Less angry. Martin considered it. Or, the anger's still there, but it's pointed at something specific now, instead of just out. He looked at the roof section he'd been patching. He wants to file his own account with Foss. About the letter, make sure it's part of the record. He paused. I told him it was his decision. It is, Silas said. Clara said the same thing, almost exactly the same words. He looked at Silas with a brief, dry expression. When my wife and a man I've known 3 weeks agree on something, I've learned to take it seriously. Silas stayed for an hour and helped with the roof, because the job needed 2 people and there was no good reason to ride away from a task half done when he had the time. They worked without much talking, which was its own kind of conversation, and when the section was solid, Martin said he owed him a meal, and Silas said he had to get back, and they both understood that neither of those statements was entirely the point. He rode back up the ridge in the early afternoon and came through the cabin door to find Lydia at the table with a letter in her hands, and her face doing something he hadn't seen it do before, something open and unguarded in a way that made him stop just inside the door. She looked up and saw his expression. It's not bad, she said quickly. It's not bad news. He came in and closed the door. She set the letter on the table. It's from my mother's sister, she said. My aunt, in the Western County. She looked at the letter again. I wrote to her 2 months ago. When I decided to put my name on the public record, I wanted her to know before someone else told her. She paused. I didn't know if she'd answer. She answered, he said. She answered. She touched the edge of the letter without picking it up. She says my father's debts were settled 8 months ago. The men he owed, she says one of them died and the estate didn't pursue the remainder, and the other one found out that the money had already been recovered in another way and released the claim. She looked up. I've been running for 2 years from something that stopped chasing me 8 months ago. The room was quiet. Silas sat down across from her. He looked at the letter and then at her face, which was cycling through something complicated. Not just relief, but the particular disorientation of learning that the shape of the last several months has been different than you thought. That the fear you'd been carrying had an expiration date you didn't know about, and you'd kept carrying it past the date. You couldn't have known, he said. No. She pressed her lips together. But I could have written sooner. She paused. I was afraid to. Afraid that, I don't know, that reaching out would draw attention to where I was, that it would start something. She shook her head. I was so careful, and the thing I was being careful about was already done. He looked at her for a moment. You've been carrying this whole time something you didn't need to carry. Yes. And you still testified, still put your name on the record. She looked at him. I didn't know it was over then. I know, he said. That's the point. He held her gaze. You were willing to face it even thinking it was still real. That doesn't change because it turned out to be resolved. She was quiet for a moment. Then something in her face settled, the way things settle when you've been told the true version of something you'd been getting wrong. I can write back to her, she said. It sounded tentative, like testing a bridge she wasn't sure would hold. She says she'd like to see me, that the family would like to see me. Then write back, he said. She looked at him. It would mean going west. He held her gaze. You could go west. She studied him carefully, reading something in his face that he was trying to keep neutral and probably wasn't entirely managing. Would that be, is that what you think should happen? It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. And the honest answer was complicated in a way he hadn't fully worked out yet, so he sat with it for a moment before he spoke. I think you should do what you want to do, he said. Not what's easiest, not what requires the least from you. He paused. You've been making decisions based on running away from things. That's done now, So the question is what you actually want. She looked at the letter. I don't know yet, she said. That's a fair answer, he said. She folded the letter and set it on the shelf beside the candles, and they didn't talk about it again that day. But it sat in the cabin with them, the way important things do, present without being pushed, taking up exactly as much space as it needed. The following week, two things happened that had no relation to each other, but that Silas would later think of as connected, the way certain events that arrive together end up explaining each other in the long run. The first was that Gerald Foss, quietly and without announcement, requested the county tax records for all properties involved in Creel Valley Land Partners provisional claims going back 6 years. The clerk who handled the request, not the one with Cole's man's loyalty, who had been quietly transferred to an administrative role pending a separate review, processed it within the hour and sent word to Doris Kettner, who told Silas, who said nothing to anyone else but felt something settle another degree. The second was that a family arrived at the bottom of the ridge path. He saw them from the fence line where he'd been working. A wagon, heavily loaded, a man on the seat, and a woman beside him with a child in her lap, and another walking alongside. They'd stopped at the gate because the gate was closed, and they were looking up the path with the particular expression of people who have been traveling long enough that stopping anywhere feels significant. He came down from the fence. The man on the wagon was perhaps 40, and had the look of someone who had made a decision that cost him everything he was sure of and was still in the middle of understanding that. He explained, in the short, essential sentences of someone who has condensed a long story into its necessary parts, that they'd come from the eastern counties, that they'd lost their lease, that they had been told by someone in the valley below that there was a man on the ridge who might have room. Silas looked at the wagon, at the child on the seat, at the one walking alongside who had the watchful eyes of a child who has been through disruptions and learned to read rooms. He opened the gate. He didn't have room, exactly. The cabin was one main room and a bedroom and a barn, and he'd been sleeping in the barn himself, which meant the main room had been Lydia's space, and none of this was arranged for company. But the barn had space, and the root cellar was stocked, and the woodpile was sufficient, and there was a structure behind the property. His father's old smokehouse, solid walls, intact roof, that could be made habitable with a few days of work. He didn't think through all of it before he opened the gate. He just opened it. Lydia came out of this cabin when she heard voices, took in the situation in about 4 seconds, and went back inside to put water on. He didn't know how she'd made that calculation so fast, but he understood it was the right one. They stayed 3 days. The man's name was Henry, and his wife was Ruth, and the children were a girl named Patience, who was 6, and a boy named Cal, who was 9, and who helped Silas split wood on the second morning with a focused, serious intensity that suggested he understood that being useful was currently the best available form of security. On the third morning, Henry said they needed to move on, that they had people expecting them in the Northern Territory, and he looked at Silas with the expression men use when they owe something they don't have currency to repay. "It's fine," Silas said. "It's not nothing," Henry said. "What you did." "What we did," Silas said, because Lydia had done most of the actual work of the thing, and Henry nodded. They watched the wagon go back down the path, and Lydia stood beside Silas and said, "The smokehouse needs about 4 days of real work to be properly habitable." He looked at her. "I wasn't planning on making it habitable." "I know." She looked at the smokehouse. "But now you're thinking about it." He was thinking about it. He hadn't meant to. He'd opened a gate for a family in a wagon, and now he was standing on his property, looking at a structure that could be made into something, and he was thinking about it in a way that had less to do with that specific family and more to do with a pattern he hadn't known he was noticing until it was in front of him clearly enough to name. He'd grown up in a place people came through. That was the actual history of it, his mother's real history, the thing the candles and the kitchen garden were the evidence of. People came up the ridge path, travelers in difficult situations and occasional problems, and his mother had made space for them. Not from wealth, they'd never had wealth, but from an understanding that a roof and a fire and a meal were not diminished by being shared. His father had resented it, which was one of their fundamental incompatibilities, and his father had gotten louder about the resentment as the years wore him down, and what Silas remembered was the resenting rather than the sharing, because the resenting had been more audible. He looked at the smokehouse and thought about his mother moving through that kitchen with a certainty that had nothing to do with abundance. 4 days, he said. Lydia looked at him. Probably 5, honestly. Then 5. They started on the smokehouse that afternoon. It was bad work, the unglamorous kind, clearing out years of debris, checking the structural timber, rechinking the walls against draft. His knee complained on the second day badly enough that he worked from a low stool for several hours, which Lydia did not comment on directly, but accommodated without making it a thing, handing him materials at the height he was working rather than the height she was. He noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. On the 4th day, Martin Purcell arrived with Thomas, and the two of them showed up with tools and said they were free until the afternoon, which was more or less true and less than the whole truth. And the 4 of them finished the interior walls in 3 hours that would have taken Silas and Lydia 2 days. Clara sent food with them, which arrived in a basket that Thomas produced from his saddlebag with the slightly embarrassed expression of a young man delivering something domestic who hasn't yet made his peace with domesticity. Lydia took the basket and thanked him without making it worse, which Thomas visibly appreciated. Frances Gale came by on the 5th day with a window she'd apparently taken from a demolished outbuilding on her property, already fitted with glass, which fit the smokehouse opening so nearly perfectly that Silas stood looking at it for a moment, wondering if she'd measured it or if the frontier simply produced people who could estimate these things by eye. "How'd you know the size?" he said. "I looked at it when I was here last week," she said. She accepted the coffee Lydia handed her. It seemed like the right project. By the end of the 5th day, the smokehouse was a room. Small, plain, smelling still of its former purpose, in a way that would take a season to fade, but structurally sound and weatherproofed and not nothing. Silas stood in the doorway and looked at what had been done and felt something he didn't entirely have a name for. Not pride exactly, which was too clean, but something adjacent. Satisfaction, maybe, with an undertow of something older and more complicated. Lydia appeared at his shoulder. "It needs a stove." "I know." "Doris said there's one at the hardware store that someone traded in last month." He looked at her. "When did you talk to Doris about a stove?" "Tuesday," she said. She moved past him into the room and looked at the corner where a stove would go. She also said that the Gideon family, who've been in the valley for 12 years and whose eldest daughter is Thomas Purcell's age, mentioned to her that they have a cousin coming in the spring who needs somewhere to land while they get established. He stood in the doorway and looked at her in the room. The late afternoon light came through the new window and fell across the floor in a rectangle, and she stood in it, and he could see the thing she was doing, not planning exactly, but seeing what was possible in the way that people do when they've stopped looking at a place as temporary. "You're not going west," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wrote to my aunt." He waited. "I told her I'd found somewhere," she said. She turned to look at him. "I told her I'd like to see them, but that I was staying where I was." She paused. "She wrote back yesterday. She said she was glad." She looked at the window, the light on the floor. "She said I sounded like myself for the first time in a long time." He didn't say anything for a moment. The thing inside him that he'd been carefully not examining too directly was difficult to be careful about in the specific quality of this light, in this room they'd just built out of debris and help, and 5 days of work. "Lydia," he said. She looked at him. He was not a man who talked around things once he'd decided to stop talking around them. He'd been deciding for several weeks without knowing he was deciding, and he was done. "I want you to stay," he said, "not because of the property or the ledger or the testimony or any of the things that needed doing. Those were what they were." He held her gaze. "I want you to stay because this place makes sense with you in it, in a way it doesn't without you. And because I think—" He paused, finding the honest version. "I think you feel that too, and I'd rather say it plainly than not say it and have us both pretend I didn't mean it." She looked at him for a long moment, the way she looked at things she was taking seriously. "I stayed through the winter before you came back," she said. "I know. And after. I know that too. I wasn't waiting for you to say something," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I was here because I wanted to be here." "I know," he said. "That's part of why I'm saying it." She looked at the light on the floor, then back at him. Her face was doing several things at once, none of them easy, all of them real. "All right," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was the word people use when they've considered something honestly and found that, yes, this is the direction, and the simplest way to say so is to say yes in the flattest possible terms and let the rest of it build from there. He understood that. All right, he said back. They walked out of the new room into the last of the afternoon, and neither of them said anything more about it, because everything that needed saying had been said, and the rest would be proved over time rather than stated in advance, which was the only kind of proving that meant anything. The stove arrived from the hardware store the following week, and Joseph Eldon helped install it because he'd installed 3 stoves on his own property and knew the chimney fit mattered more than anything else. In the month that followed, the county attorney's investigation of Creel Valley Land Partners generated enough documentation to make Cole's counsel advise him, in very direct terms, that his position was untenable. The Purcell claim was withdrawn formally in the second week of December, their land returned to clear title without condition. The Harker estate, which had already transferred to Cole's company, was the subject of a separate action that was going to take longer and cost more and was less certain. The law moved slowly on transfers already completed, and everyone understood that. But it was moving. Cole himself left the valley in December, quietly, with the manner of someone relocating rather than retreating, though the distinction was mostly cosmetic. His office closed. His man, the watchful one with the bored eyes, was seen leaving on a Wednesday morning with a horse and a pack in no particular direction. The clerk with the convenient loyalty to Cole's operation resigned before Foss's investigation reached him directly, which Foss noted in his report as consistent with someone who understood what the review would find. None of this was tidy. That was the thing about how problems actually resolve. They don't close cleanly. The Harker estate case would be in motion for another year. The clerk who resigned faced no further consequence, which sat badly with people but was what the law allowed. Cole's company continued to exist on paper even with Cole gone, and his counsel sent letters to Foss through January asserting that all operations had been lawful and that any further action would be contested vigorously. Silas read Doris's accounts of all this with the careful attention of someone who'd stopped expecting complete victories and started evaluating partial ones on their actual merits. He'd learned this in the war, that good enough and clean was often the best available outcome, and that the insistence on total resolution was usually the enemy of any resolution at all. The Purcells had their land. Frances Gale had her land. Garrett had a signed document confirming his title that Foss had expedited as part of the investigation process. The pattern of Cole's operation was on the county record now, which meant the next man who tried it in this valley would have less darkness to work in. He told this to Lydia on an evening in January when they were sitting by the fire, and she'd asked him directly how he felt about the way things had ended. "Not as clean as I wanted," he said honestly. Cole should have faced something more direct than inconvenience. "Yes," she said. "And the Harker family is still in a fight." "Yes. But the Purcells are home." He looked at the fire. "And this—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he moved his hand slightly, a gesture that meant the cabin, the ridge, the winter outside, all of it. "This is ours." She looked at the fire too. "It was always yours." "It was yours too," he said, "before I came back. You made it yours." He paused. "That's not nothing." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not nothing." The kitchen garden she'd restored came up in the spring. She planted it in the same configuration his mother had used. He'd described it once, not thinking she'd hold it precisely. And when the rows came in, she stood looking at them with her hands on her hips, an expression that was satisfaction and something more personal mixed together. He came and stood beside her. "You remembered the layout," he said. "You told me once." "I mentioned it once." She looked at him sideways. "I was paying attention." The ranch didn't transform overnight. That wasn't how things worked, and they both knew it, and neither of them had the temperament for grand gestures anyway. What happened was slower and more ordinary and more durable for being so. The smokehouse room was occupied for 6 weeks in March and April by the Gideon cousin, a young man named Peter, who was quiet and useful and helped build the fence extension on the north pasture before he moved into a place of his own in the valley. A widow from 2 ridges over stayed 10 days after a tree fell on her roof in a late storm. Martin Purcell's family came for Sunday dinner twice a month, which had started as a single invitation and then simply continued by mutual agreement without anyone formally proposing it. Thomas Purcell, who had been angry in the specific misdirected way of young men who are capable of more than their circumstances have yet allowed, started talking to Silas. The way young men sometimes talk to older ones when they've run out of people their own age to figure things out with. He wanted to know about the cavalry, about land, about how a man decided what he was going to stand for. Silas answered him directly, which was mostly what he needed. Not wisdom exactly, just someone who didn't soften the actual shape of things. One evening in April, sitting on the fence rail in the last of the light, Thomas said, "Do you think what we did made a difference? With coal and everything." Silas thought about it genuinely, which was the only way he knew how to answer that kind of question. "To the Purcells it did," he said. "To Francis. To Garrett." He looked at the ridge falling away below them. "To people we don't know who might have come next." He paused. "Whether it changed the larger thing, the way men like Cole operate, the conditions that let them, no. Probably not much." Thomas frowned. "That seems like what?" "Not enough." "It's not enough," Silas agreed, "but it's what was available." He looked at the young man. "You do what you can reach, Thomas. You do it right, and you don't pretend it was bigger than it was, and you don't let the fact that it wasn't bigger make you decide it wasn't worth doing." He paused. "The Purcell land is yours. That's real. It happened because people stood in the same direction at the same time." He shrugged. "That's most of what good things are made of." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara says you're the stubbornest man she's ever met." "Your mother's been generous to me," Silas said, and Thomas laughed, genuine and short, and they sat on the fence in the evening and watched the light go off the ridge. In May, Lydia started teaching. It began informally. Frances Gale's granddaughter visited for 2 weeks, and Lydia found herself explaining reading to her at the kitchen table in the afternoons, and then the granddaughter mentioned it to her mother, who mentioned it to someone else. And by June, there were 4 children coming up the ridge path twice a week to sit at the table and work through the books Lydia had accumulated over 2 years of carrying only what she could keep. She had not planned it. It had found her, the way the cabin had found her, the way most of the things that fit her had found her when she stopped running long enough to be found. Silas watched this without comment for several weeks, and then one evening said, "You should have a proper space for it." She looked at him. "The table's fine. The table's also where we eat and where I work on the property ledger and where Doris Kettner sits when she comes to talk about county affairs." He paused. "You should have a room." She thought about it. "The smokehouse is already spoken for when people need it." He looked at the back of the property, toward the structure his father had used as a workshop, which was larger and better lit than the smokehouse, and had been on his list of things to address eventually. The workshop. She looked at it. He could see her doing what she'd done in the smokehouse, seeing past what it was to what it could be, measuring not with her eyes but with some other instrument that accounted for work and time and what things were worth. "That's a considerable project," she said. "It is," he agreed. "You'd need help. Probably the Purcells again, and Eldon. And Frances Gale will send that window from the wrong outbuilding again, and it'll fit perfectly because she measures things with her eyes." He looked at her. The thing that happened in his face when she made him almost laugh without quite making him laugh. She could see it, and she'd stopped pretending she didn't. "Probably," he said. She looked at the workshop. The spring evening settled around them, the kind of evening that is mild and long and doesn't make any demands of you, that just exists without agenda, and in it the ridge and the cabin and the property and everything they'd built and defended and kept were simply there, ordinary and particular and entirely theirs. "All right," she said, for the second time, in the same flat and decisive way, and this time he understood the full weight of it, not just the agreement about the workshop, but the agreement underneath the agreement, the one that said, "I am here, I am staying, I am in." He understood because he felt it too. They were not the same people they'd been in October when a man had pushed open a door and found a stranger in his father's house, and not known what to do with her. He was not fixed. He was too old and too scarred to use that word, and she was too honest to let him get away with it anyway. But he was something. He was present in a way he hadn't been in a long time, present in a specific place with specific people for reasons that were real rather than reasons he'd settled for because he was out of better ones. And she was not the frightened girl who'd needed a roof and found this one and stayed longer than she'd planned because leaving felt wasteful. She was someone who had chosen, deliberately and with open eyes, to put her name on a public record and stand in a county courtroom and say, "This place is real, this person is real, this matters." She was someone who had taught a child to read at a kitchen table and was going to teach 4 more in a workshop that hadn't been built yet, but would be. Neither of them had gotten here cleanly. That was the truth of it, the real truth, not the version you tell when you want things to sound better than they are. He'd spent 8 years running in the shape of a man with direction, and she'd spent 2 years running from a shadow that had stopped chasing her. They'd both arrived here worn down and cautious, and not at all sure the place would hold their weight. It had held. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. In June, on a warm evening, Silas was sitting on the front step with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands when Lydia came and sat beside him. Not close enough to be a statement about anything, just beside him, the way you sit beside someone whose presence you've stopped needing to explain. The ridge fell away below them into the valley going gold in the evening light, the whole ordinary geography of a place they'd fought for and stayed in and built something in, imperfect and persistent and entirely real. "The candles," he said. She looked at him. "You put them there the first night," he said, "before I came back, before you knew if I'd ever come back." He looked at the light on the valley. 3 candles, exactly where she kept them. She was quiet for a moment. "I told you. I don't know entirely why." "I think you do," he said. "I think you put them there because you were keeping something alive that deserved to stay alive." He paused. "Even if nobody came. Even if nobody saw it." He looked at his coffee. "That's what you do. That's what you've always done. You keep things going that deserve to keep going, even when there's no guarantee it matters." She looked at the valley for a while. The light moved on it the way light does in the late afternoon, slow and even and without urgency. And the ridge held all of it the way it had been holding things for longer than any of them had been here, and would go on holding after they were done. "Someone taught me that," she said finally, "a long time ago." She didn't look at him. She kept 3 candles. She sat with me in the night. She didn't promise anything she couldn't keep. A pause. She just stayed. He didn't say anything. "I've been trying to be someone who stays," Lydia said, "for a long time." She looked at her hands. "It took me a while to find somewhere worth staying for." The evening settled around them, and Hector made a sound in the barn that was his standard complaint about the dinner hour approaching, and somewhere down in the valley a dog was barking at something it had probably imagined, and the light went slowly off the ridge the way it went every evening, without drama, just the ordinary end of a day, in a place where days ended and then came back. Silas sat on the front step of his father's house, his house, theirs, and felt the specific and unspectacular weight of being somewhere that had fought to have him and that he had fought to keep, and thought about all the miles between the boy who had stood in a yard with a rifle because his mother was watching, and the man sitting here now, and how none of those miles had been straight and none of them had been easy, and how all of them, even the worst of them, had delivered him to this. I didn't say any of that. It wasn't the kind of thing that improved by being said. He just finished his cold coffee and sat in the evening beside the woman who had kept his mother's candles burning for a man she didn't know would ever come home, and let the ordinary world do what it did, which was simply continue. That was when it